Welcome to the AICPA Town Hall Series, your resource for the latest news and updates on pressing issues facing the accounting profession.
Good afternoon and welcome to this Thursday, May 4th edition of the AICPA Town Hall. May the 4th be with you. Lisa Simpson, that was for you, Lisa. So I fulfilled my promise. But hello, everyone. My name is Michael Cerami with CPAcom, and I'll be your host for today, sitting in for Eric Auskerson. So welcome. I'm very excited to be joined here in studio by Association President and CEO Barry Melanson. Barry, it's great to be with you today.
It's great to be with you, Michael.
Barry, you know, one of the things, we continue to have this March to 100, which is pretty exciting. So today marks the 98th episode of the AICPA Town Hall. Pretty remarkable.
Yeah, thanks that you've been a big part of it as well, and all of our guests. We have a great guest today as well, and I think that just the feedback is incredible. I'll tell you a quick story. I was with just recently with a group of CEOs and several firm CEOs, reasonably sized firms, and several of them said they don't miss town halls. So
that's right.
It's the CEOs, it's small firms, it's business and industry, it's government,
must-see TV.
It's must-see TV,
That's
right? Well,
great.
maybe not TV, but
all right. Well, just like the other 97 episodes, today's 98th episode is filled, a very filled agenda, lots of great content. So let's go ahead and jump in. We're going to start off in just a moment with a DC and profession update with Barry. We're then joined by a very special guest you may have seen just a second ago in that wider shot, Dan Hood. Dan is the editor-in-chief of Accounting Today, and Accounting Today just published their top 100 firm report, and so Dan's here with a lot of great observations and insights. So we're really excited to be joined in studio by Dan. We'll then bring in fan favorite Lisa Simpson. Lisa's gonna come in and give us a brief or relatively brief technical update today. And then Lisa will be joined by AICPA Public Accounting CEO Sue Coffey. And together they're going to talk to you about some of the strategies around that the AICPA has around accelerating the pipeline and the plan for that. And then we'll kind of all regroup and we'll have open forum. So with that, let's go ahead and jump in. There's our esteemed panel of speakers for today. So Barry, let's bring you in to start. So the debt limit comes into full view next week. You know, there's really no off ramp for the debt limit, and you know, this bill is going to require, whatever bill goes forward is going to require partisan support. So break this bipartisan support. So go ahead and break that down for us.
Yeah, you know, there was a big discussion the last town hall, and we're not going to go into as much detail on it this meeting, but I think it's important for everybody just to be sort of up to date. I mean, maybe the most significant event in the last week or so is Secretary of Treasury Janet Yellen said that what is called the X date, where the obligation issue comes into play really from a cash flow perspective, could be as early as June 1. Now, you know, as most things are in Washington, there could be some politics on that. You know, we understand the cash flow of the federal government from a tax perspective. All your clients and companies and stuff with June 15 estimated tax payments. June 15th is a big influx of money into the government, and so, you know, there's a lot of noise in DC about whether June 1 is really a really significant date or not. And there's actually been some studies that say that if we get to June 15th, then actually that X date will, you know, could actually be August or so. Goldman Sachs has done some economic studies on that. So that's sort of one big thing. The other is that, you know, President Biden has been critical before the passage of the House Republican debt ceiling bill, saying, well, what's your plan, Republicans? I want a clean bill. I want a clean bill, nothing but just an extension of the debt limit. And well, you know, they passed that bill. We talked about it last time, but they passed that bill. And now there's going to be a sit down. Next week, there's going to be a sit down with the president and the leaders of Congress, bipartisan, as you said, and that sort of element is really, really, really critical. Now the game becomes what is in something that might pass, right? So it's almost impossible to imagine what the Republicans passed in the House actually becoming the answer, right? Because there's a 6-vote majority in the House. It was obviously passed, but You got a Democratic majority in the Senate. You got a Democratic president. That's not likely to be the answer. But the real answer is, how does this get compromised? And really, for our issues, and maybe shifting off of the debt limit per se, our issues is really about what else might get in that bill. And we've been talking about a lot of issues in many town halls. The R&D tax credit, we get that question a lot, right, Michael? Yeah. We get, people worried about it, they get clients that are really in a tough situation. Well, there's some noise in the system. Well, there's some support to the package of extenders getting legislated. We've said all along it needs a piece of legislation that moves through the process that can actually have it happen. Well, the debt limit bill could be. Now, I don't want to oversell that, because I think the odds of things like this getting in it are actually pretty low. It still may take some other type of legislation. Another one out there is the whole 1099-K issue, where we've advocated for a higher limit than what has now been put in law at the $600. So, we've been very vocal on both of those pieces of legislation. Another one is in sort of the broad notion of cannabis legislation, which actually clarifies some exposure that financial institutions and others might have in that space, that even though it's still a listed narcotic in the federal statutes, that they would be okay providing certain services. And that definition is broad enough to make it clear that CPAs will be okay as well. And we have also been big advocates of something we call fiscal state, in which we're proponents of legislation that requires the Congress to come together once a year and to receive the audited accrual basis financial statement of the federal government. And they budget on cash basis. We all understand that. But understanding the liabilities of the country, which exceed 120 trillion when you bring in all of the off-balance sheet items and you take it into a full accrual basis, that's pretty important for members of Congress, people who are voting on things that affect us every day, that really need to understand that. And any of those could be part of it. None of them could be part of it. And believe me, there are a lot of other groups out there that have their most important issues that they would like to see part of it as well. So the odds go down that any of that gets in it. The odds go up, however, that it's probably not going to be just a clean bill, because it's got to go through a House majority Republican. And actually in the Senate, it takes 60 votes. And one of the Democratic senators, Senator Dianne Feinstein from California, is basically out right now. So there's, you got to get to some compromise to get it through the process. So June 1, whether it's real or not, is a really important date. And if it's not, then of course all of this gets continued until, let's say, August.
Yeah, thanks, Barry. That's a great breakdown. It sounds like next week's a very big week, so we should have a little bit more clarity from that. And so we also had the new IRS Commissioner at Ways and Means hearing. It seems like all the discussion around this goes right to what's happening with the $80 billion, but
it's political. Both sides of the aisle are arguing on that point. People who have been on the town halls have talked to me about, closing the gap and not touching people below 400,000 of income is pretty hard, because a lot of the unrecorded income, the entrepreneurial income, is below those thresholds. And then on the other side of the aisle, the Republicans talk about, all these agents with guns, and that's not likely to be the outcome either. But it's still a political hot point, right? And it will be much part of that debate around the limit, the debt limit. What can be cut back, what should be cut back, and of course, a lot of that money hopefully will get redirected to services and technology that really helps the profession, helps the taxpayers, and helps to prepare a community. Another thing, and he testified last week, and another thing though that I think is really important, and a big topic we've had here, is the ERC. And we all know that the IRS has to do some things to the extent that it can, if we're going to sort of have some rational notion in this ERC space. And he was very directly asked that question: what can the IRS do to curtail some of this wildness that is out there? It was a very direct question, which was great. And Commissioner Werfel's response was to the congressman, I'd like to meet with you and work with you to talk about things that we can do within our, remit, within the law, and what might need to be changed for us to do other things. And so that's at least a sign of hope that it's on, pretty high radar screen when the commissioner is willing to talk about it from that standpoint.
And Barry, as more and more things, technology just impact continues, maybe talk a little bit about the mailbox rule.
Right. So this is not about legislation affecting your post person coming to your mailbox. That's not what this is about. This is a really technical point, but it takes legislation. So before we get a bunch of questions just saying, why can't the IRS just do it from a regulation perspective? It actually takes legislation, and it really is about how do we equate the handling of taxpayers filing, timely filing, in sort of the old world of paper and things of that nature versus the electronic world. And so we all know the process in the paper world. You get the tax return in the mail, it get postmarked at April 15th if that was the due date, and if there was something wrong with that return, the signature wasn't there or something that wasn't quite right, it would get sent back to the taxpayer and they still had a timely filed return. But in the electronic world, it doesn't work that way, and taxpayers are at a greater disadvantage. So the mailbox rule is sort of the notion that if it leaves the mailbox of the processor that is sending in the return, that ought to be the date of demarcation, if you will, from a taxpayer perspective, as opposed to the date that the IRS actually opens the e-file and deals with it, or returns something. Maybe there's a transposition of the Social Security number or something, it gets kicked out. That shouldn't cause that to be an untimely filed return. It's a very technical nuance, but very important to people. Sure, and can be very costly. And in our crazy world, this takes legislation. And so it's something that we'd like to see get remedied and just put some rationality into the tax system here.
Yeah, it's very technical and nuanced, but seems very obvious. So great to bring some clarity.
Of course, obvious and legislation do not always go together.
Well, thank you, Barry. Great update. Lots happening. Again, next week's going to be a big week on the debt limit conversation, so we'll stay tuned and we'll have an update clearly on the May 18th town hall. So let's pivot here for a second and invite in our guest. Again, Dan Hood. Dan is the editor-in-chief for Accounting Today. Widely read. Dan and his team do a great job of covering the accounting profession from kind of all angles. And Dan, you guys just recently published your report on that really focuses on the top 100 firms, but then also regional firm leaders. So would love to talk to you a little bit about some of the big findings that you guys saw this year.
Absolutely. First off, psyched to be here on the number 98 on the road to 100. Very exciting. But the short version of it is that 2022 was a fantastic year for the largest firms in the profession. Really extraordinary growth rate, 18.5%. This is the third highest growth rate we've seen in the 30 years we've been doing the report. Wow. And it's the highest this century. You have to go back to 1997 and 98 to get growth rates this high. And one of the key drivers of that is growth at the big four and the billion-dollar firms. We got 4 new billion-dollar firms this year, which is extraordinary. Usually we had 1 or 2 every 3 or 4 years. Last year we added 4 new. The big four firms had growth rates close to 20%, which is very unusual. Usually they're sort of moderating. When you add everybody together, their growth rates moderate everybody else's growth rates. The smaller top 100 firms are really the ones that grow faster. But this year, or I should say in 2022, they had a spectacular year. So they really pushed everybody's rates up. Now, that's not to say that those other groups weren't doing very well as well. Firms between, it's about 49 firms between $100 million and $1 billion in revenue. They also had an 18% growth rate. And then the firms below, there's about 37 firms on the list below 100 million. They had a 15% growth rate. So everyone, fantastic year. We expect that'll change a little bit in 2023. We're seeing maybe not as strong growth among the big four and the billion-dollar firms, but for 2022, really an amazing year, just firing on all cylinders.
Yeah, it's pretty remarkable. Even normalizing it when you pull out the big four. Also here, it seems like overall hiring increased as well across the board.
Stunningly, right?
Yeah.
Not a number that anyone would have expected, given problems. I know we're going to talk about the pipeline later and staffing difficulties. Everybody it's an odd thing. Yes, growth rates for staff very high, higher than we've seen in several years. But at the same time, everybody reports that staffing is a number one priority and they're having big problems with it. Some of that growth is driven by M&A. So, right, if you add a whole new firm, that's a big growth to your thing. But we're also seeing firms just reach out in different ways for hiring. They're not just hiring CPAs and accountants anymore. Particularly if you look at the big four, they're also driving a lot of that because they're hiring a lot of non-accountants for other specialty roles or just for roles that might in the past they might have hired an accountant for, but now they're looking for other people. So.
Impressive. So Dan, let's talk a little bit. It was great in reading your article. I mean, you guys kind of talked about this growth toolkit, meaning firms have been very intentional about how they're achieving growth, and they really have. It seems like a very, kind of a multitude of strategies that they're employing to drive it. It seems some in the more traditional way, which is M&A and like geographic expansion, cross-selling. But also there's a lot of newer creative ways that they're driving growth. Maybe talk about both of those.
Sure, absolutely. And the high level there, right, is when we ask these questions every year, how are you going to grow next year? What's your plans? And every year, ordinarily, they would say, well, we're going to do some M&A, or we're going to work on our marketing, or we're going to work on our staffing, or whatever the case may be. They'd have one or two things they were going to do. Over the past 3 or 4 years, what we've seen is all of these firms effectively are sending us lists, long lists of 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 things they're doing. You said the traditional things about M&A and organic growth, but then they're adding new things like looking at their client lists and saying, these are the clients we want. These aren't the clients we're looking for. So they're looking at their marketing, they're looking at technology and automation and working to enable their advisory services. And they're looking at upskilling their staff. They're looking at a whole wide range of things as opposed to just one or two. And it speaks to a bunch of different trends. One of the main ones we look at is the fact that they have to manage every aspect of the firm. Used to be for literally years, firms could some things just manage themselves. This is just how firms work. And now they're saying, no, we've got to pay careful attention and really make sure we're working on every aspect of the firm to get the growth that we need.
Yeah, and I think to just pick up on that, and first off, thank you for being here. And it is a 2022, and it's interesting. Here we sit just a little bit after the data was gathered, right? But the world's a little different. Clearly a lot of the transactional services that sit on the advisory side of firms is certainly in today's economic world slowing down. It's going to probably have some effect in these numbers that we're going to be talking about a year from now. I think that you also have a situation where frankly, some of the M&A is still happening, but it may not be happening quite as much as it was. And, you talk about the $1 billion firms, not counting the big four, but there will be more. I mean, there'll be more that are going to cross that threshold. That's a big, mental threshold for a lot of firms. And that is clearly going to be some of the things that are going to happen from that standpoint. Any thoughts on that process?
Well, there are absolutely some firms that are poised. They're one merger away or one really strong year of growth from joining that cohort. So yeah, absolutely, we expect to see a few more. I don't with the time frame, who could say? But yeah, but sooner probably than we expect, because there are, like I said, that sort of launching point. And M&A drives a lot of that. That's what drove a lot of the 4 firms that added. But they're also all having strong organic growth as well. So now that will be different, as you say. The transaction stuff this year is going to be. We expect it to be tougher, particularly for those larger firms. And they're big ships, hard to move. Sorry,
hard to move. No, you're right, and the economy is just we got to be realistic about what's happening in the economy. Continuing to raise interest rates to fight inflation. Of course, inflation has had some impact on revenue numbers because that is reflected in the service lines as well. But there is a caution. We look at the banking situation today, still not too far in the rearview mirror of the FTX situation. There's just a caution that's out there that I think is as we talk to firms in all sizes, right? In all of the spectrums, even below the top 100, like you're talking about, there's a bit more caution. There's still tremendous opportunity. There's no question about that. But I think as the firms, sort of deal with 2023 and beyond, it'll be interesting to see if it's more of like a normalcy type of notion than the extraordinary of 2022.
Right. Yeah, that may well be, and that is it's going to be hard to match it, right? There are such extraordinary growth numbers. But one of the things that's encouraging, right, despite the economic headwinds that you're pointing out, which make perfect sense, is that firms are also, like we said, being very intentional about their growth and thinking very carefully about it. One of the big things they're doing, right, is shifting their base to focus more on advisory services, on niches. So they're being a little proactive, and some of that is in reaction to the very sort of the challenges and the concerns that you're talking about. So they're hopefully paying them attention, and we'll pay more attention now that we've been talking about it. But it will be a little slower. That's certainly.
And I think as we go on down the size spectrum, the point about niches become even more prevalent because the notion of where do you find growth in a smaller firm, and particularly if the economy is slowing down, that niche, the great service, industry niches, but a service niche as well, I think becomes a very important strategy point for firms. I would say too that I think what we will see, if I could be a little predictive about maybe a conversation like this a year from now, I think certainly in the next year, but certainly in the next 2 to 3 years, and particularly in maybe the top 500 firms or the top 1,000 firms, I think global taxation issues that their clients face. We're talking about debt limits here, and we're talking about deficits and things, but there's all types of tension in government around the globe, right? There's a war in Eastern Europe and the spending associated with that, but there's economic impact, less receipts, and so tax increases and multinational tax increases are going to be part of it. And I think that is, when I say multinational, we went through a decade in which countries were very sensitive about their tax policies attracting sort of and positioning themselves being in a global footprint.
Right.
And there's a little bit more defensiveness in that in countries today. And so that's going to be a more aggressive tax posture. I think certainly, let's say those top 1,000 firms, as their clients do business outside the United States or they're involved in that, they're going to see a big growth in this global sort of tax notion of things.
Yep. Well, we've seen among the top 100 growing interest in international tax. We do a sort of what niches are you big in, and international tax has been growing. But as you say, it's been growing in that environment of people being countries want to attract people. So their tax regimes were not quite as complex, not quite as defensive.
Right.
As they get more defensive, right, the need for advisory services, and that makes perfect sense that would grow.
I mean, just even countries in the Middle East are putting in taxes for the first time in their history, corporate taxes and things. So it's a pretty interesting environment. We are going to talk about human capital later, but I do think too that when you think about growth in the firms, there is this, it merges become this, but there is just sort of the more success, the harder it is to sustain that growth. That number, that denominator, or that revenue number times the whatever percentage you want is a bigger hit, even though the percentage target might be the same.
Yep. And it just keeps reinforcing the need to really think carefully about it. When you say you want to grow 10%, what's in your pipeline, right? A lot of firms will say we want to grow 10%. Then you look at the number of clients they're talking to, and they don't have it. Those numbers aren't there, and you can't make that goal if you haven't thought about that. And then that requires thinking about your service mix and thinking about do you have the staff to support it. So it's astonishing how much it all comes to this. You've really got to think about the whole firm and how it supports those growth goals.
So Dan, we got a couple of questions coming in. I think two-part maybe. One, I think we want to be clear, or maybe I'll ask you to clarify, is the growth that you're seeing is in overall personnel. It's not, well, I've had a significant amount of layoffs or resignations, and so my hiring spiked up. It's new. Yeah, it's new. The firms are getting bigger. Put it that way. The employer pool is getting bigger. And then maybe how do you reconcile it? And maybe it's a timing thing, with people hearing about big layoffs at some of the higher end of the market, particularly. I mean, just any thoughts on that? Because it seems to.
It's probably worth remembering. This is 2022, so it's a little bit before some of those started to hit the thing. But it's just firms. One of the things we hear about them all is they're all desperate for, they've got more work than they can possibly do. Right. So they're hiring. Last year, one of the big trends was hiring recruiters. Half the top 100 firms had hired internal recruiters, and often they'd hire one or two recruiters for different functions. One was for high level or more experienced hires, and one was for entry level. So that's a trend that they're looking at. Is how do we hire? How do we professionalize that? How do we go out there and really make it a big deal, as opposed to just posting a job and a job ad and hoping.
But 2 points on the human capital that clearly would be prevalent as we're sitting here in May of 2023 compared to this data. One is turnover rates inside firms are way down because of the overall environment of the economy, but also other industry segments. So we can say tech, we can say financial services, banking and financial services, which are been the two highest profile sort of industry segments with very significant layoffs. There is this whole cohort of new people in the marketplace seeking out employment, which is totally different than coming out of COVID and into 2022.
Right. And it's also, they're not sucking as many people away, right?
Well, and it sounds
like
both.
It's less push and
it sounds like in your data, there's also very clear strategies that firms have around retention that maybe is paying off. So
Absolutely,
people,
yeah.
you don't have turnover.
They've been working very hard on that, making
Right.
sure their environments during 2021, they were talking about 2-3 salary reviews a year. To be like,
Wow.
well, we make sure we're keeping up outside of the Great Resignation, but they're still doing that. They're upping benefits. They're up doing regular salary reviews. So yeah, they're very much paying a lot of attention to
Focused
that.
on
Hope and paying it out.
So let's jump into a few of the slides, Dan, because people have been asking just maybe how we measured some of this, and then where is the growth coming from? And I know you have a couple of data points on that. So I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about the how you measured growth.
Right, it's net revenue. So we asked them to report their net revenue previous year, net revenue this year, and do the percent change from it. We don't break it down by organic and M&A, though we do ask them to report the individual M&A deals they've been involved in, but we don't break down which percentage of their growth came from that, unfortunately. But yeah, so we've seen that previous one just broke down how the difference is between the firms below $1 billion and the firms over $1 billion, and you see their growth rates very different over the years. And just the first year, those $1 billion firms sort of really outpaced them. This is a great one. We love this in part because it shows the rise of CAS. We're talking about advisory services and all these advisors. This is all the firms that are seeing growth in these areas. So it's something like 80 firms are seeing growth in a test. A test is always the leader. It has been, I went back last night, looked at this and just checked. It's always been the leader except for 2021 when CAS was number one, which nothing else has ever been number one except a test. And it just skyrocketed over the past 5 years, rose up to the top. And we expect it to sort of stick right around there, would be number two for a long time. But some of those other advisory services, IT and data security, business valuations, estate trust, gift tax, estate trust has been there forever. That's always been relatively high. But IT and data security, very new, last 8 years or so, rising up the ranks. So we're seeing a lot of the advisory firms sort of not struggle because they're not struggling, but they're sort of rising up through the ranks as opposed to some of the more compliance-based services.
Sure. And again, a sort of a leading and a lagging indicator. So again, if we would have had a town hall 5 years ago, we'd have been talking about CAS as a very important part. We'd have also been talking about SALT as a very important part. And we've also been talking about data security and cyber in a different way, new services that were being developed. And I would say one of the things that's being talked about today that probably won't hit this chart next year, but in the next few years is going to be in the ESG space.
Absolutely. It's already,
you actually called that out in your report, right?
it's up there, it's on the list, and it generally takes 2 or 3 years from when we put some on the list for it to get to the top, because it's a 60 niche list. But ESG is definitely already in the last 2 years jumped significantly. It just hasn't reached above to get into the top 10 like this.
Right.
But you're absolutely right. Absolutely.
And we're highlighting here some of the niche industries that were called out in the report, like you said, which is very interesting. I think one question too that came in, Dan, was just, how, I don't know if you have a data point on this, but maybe how much of the growth was attributed to pricing, price changes versus. I don't know if there's just
we don't get a statistic on that. Our sense is that was not for much of the year less of driver as it was towards the end of the year. So, but we don't have, that's anecdotal, and I could be. I would make a prediction on it, but
I would take. I don't have your data obviously, but I think there was probably a little bit more than maybe you might think, just because I know even on the attest side that there was a piece of that was happening, and clearly in the tax area. So I think it's a piece of that. I mean, it's certainly not all of it. It's not even, half of it, but it is a piece of that.
And so, Dan, what I want to do now, first, just want to make mention, the push into advisory services has been continuous, no sign of it slowing down, but I'm just putting on the screen here for folks some of the resources that we've developed around some of these new emerging areas and how firms can play more of an advisory role. But our conversation just now focused on the larger firms. We're bringing in Lisa Simpson because I think the patterns that we're seeing, frankly, extend out across the firm landscape. And so, Lisa, want to invite you maybe to talk a little bit about that, and you might even have some questions for Dan specifically on it.
Thanks, Michael. It was a great conversation, and I think looking at the Q&A, there's some questions about, okay, so how do I connect the dots to my firm that maybe isn't in the top 20, the top 50, or the top 100. And I think a lot of the key points that you all talked about, defining strategy, picking your niche, working on calling your clients, are these the clients that I want to serve, are all the ways that firms below these top 100 can also think about as they're working on their growth plans if growth is what they're after as they look to the future. So it's just really important, and you'll hear us talking a lot over the course of the year, and I tell everybody until I retire that we'll be talking about how to help firms think about what they're doing for the business, working on the business rather than working in the business. So I'm excited because a lot of what you all have talked about today ties into the work we're doing to provide strategy resources for firms. So you'll see those coming out very soon that will help firms of all sizes really dig into what are their objectives and what are the strategies to hit those objectives. So great conversation. Some questions about, do small firms even have a place in the profession? And I think the answer is absolutely. And I know that everyone sitting in the studio in New York sees this. Small firms, Barry used an analogy of it's hard to turn a battleship. Small firms can be very agile, and they can be very, very flexible in the technologies that they're using to try to power growth quickly, again, if that's their objective. So we certainly think that small firms have a strong position in the market. And, in my opinion, strategy, niching, making sure you know who your ideal client is, those are all going to be ways for firms of all sizes to succeed.
Thank you, Lisa. Great points. Couldn't agree more on the small firm point in particular. We're going to go ahead now and turn it over to you for a technical update, and then to bring in Sue. Dan and Barry will both be back with us for open forum shortly. So, Lisa, with that, we'll go ahead and hand it over to you.
Thank you. And one thing before I move into the technical, PCPS does a benchmarking survey that will be launching in about a couple of weeks, maybe even sooner. It's called the PCPS CPAcom Map Survey, because we love acronyms. So if you have if you've participated in the past, you know how beneficial that is. And it will allow us to answer some of your questions about what did growth look like outside of those top 100 firms. It is the largest benchmarking survey in the profession. We would love everyone on this call to participate, and just stay tuned for your invitation. All right, so from a technical standpoint, I'm going to keep it pretty quick, but we wanted to let you know about the latest disaster relief that that came out just May 1, so just a few days ago. And this relates to the storms that were in Florida right before the filing deadline. So I know that was just a real impactful situation there in the Fort Lauderdale area. So a little bit late, but better late than never. The disaster relief filing extensions have been approved for that area. So we've given you a link to the actual details that list the particular counties and areas. And I also wanted to point out, just like we did last time, we've got a great Tax Section Odyssey podcast if you aren't as familiar with those disaster relief provisions as you'd like to be. So some good intel there. And then we have some ERC news. Barry mentioned that in Commissioner Werfel's testimony early this week, he was asked about what's the IRS doing around ERC. And the answer is they're starting their audits. Through our friends on Tax Twitter, we were shown some of the basic questions that are being asked of employers who took ERC. So just wanted to give you a heads up on that. We've talked in the past about all of those, let's just call them folks who've gone over to the dark side in terms of ERC aggressiveness, who may not be following all of the specifics around eligibility, primarily around a suspension of operations and tying those back to a governmental order, or they're not documenting a decline in gross receipts. So my reminder to you is that if you have a client who is considering taking ERC or who has taken it, that documentation in the files around their eligibility, very specifically highlighting the provisions that make them eligible, would be important. And then some very direct questions about, did the employer take a PPP loan? Did they get forgiveness? Asking for copies of the forgiveness letter and detailing that out to the wages that were used for forgiveness to make sure they're not double counted for ERC as well. So your heads up on ERC notices, they are beginning. And we have just a reminder of the library of resources that we have on ERC. You'll see on the next slide, we've given you links to a great podcast. That Factor Fiction resource is really helpful. And then the continuing library that we have there. And then I wanted to call out a new podcast. Last town hall, if you remember, we had a conversation with Jason Statz about the chat GPT, generative AI, and some other things. So April Walker has a new podcast out with Ashley Francis, and it's discussing ChatGPT, AI, data security. Really interesting conversation and fun too. So just a reminder to, if you haven't subscribed for those, they're really insightful, and I'd recommend that you check those out. Okay, so wanted to have a quick technical update so that we could spend more time talking about the pipeline acceleration plan. So I'll invite Sue Coffey to join us. Sue, I'm sure you probably all know, is our CEO of Public Accounting. And welcome, Sue. You've made you've been on the town hall in the past, and the last time was a quick discussion about some of the work that you've been doing on pipeline acceleration. You've been talking to lots of stakeholders across the entire profession. So wanted to give you some time to dig into that and let us know about some of the things that you've been working on.
Hi, Lisa, and thanks for having me here. And I really appreciate the opportunity. And, it's interesting. There are so many insights that we're getting out of all of these conversations with practitioners across the country. I know from previous town halls, some in the audience think that the 150 hours of education is an easy fix to our pipeline challenges. But what we're learning is that while the cost of education is admittedly a factor, it is certainly not the only hurdle, nor is it even close to the top of the list in terms of issues that young adults have told us why they aren't interested in our profession. And the latest research we have, which you can see on this slide, really tells us, unfortunately, that there are negative perceptions about our profession and stereotypes. That's a big part of it. But also, and I know we've talked about this before, starting salaries, long hours, inflexibility, they play a role as well. And, I'm guilty of this too. We are not great at telling our story about the impact we have on things like our country's economy and local businesses and our communities. We really do have an amazing story to tell, and we need to talk about it more. But all of this means, when you look at all, this research that's finally coming to light, it means we need a multi-pronged approach to addressing the problem. And there's no one solution that's going to tackle it, right? And that's why we came up with our pipeline acceleration plan, which is designed to get to the root causes of the challenge. Those things like awareness and attractiveness of our profession to young adults and their parents, particularly high school students. Absolutely the cost of higher education, the ease and flexibility to get kind of across the CPA finish line once you're kind of in the system. There are, all those root causes, and we need to tackle them. And some of the things that we're thinking about and some of the things we're actually executing on now will solve multiple things, and some of them may solve only one, but we have to look at it as a package. A couple other things, there are some bright spots in what we're seeing, and I think they're worth mentioning too. You heard Dan and Barry mention the layoffs that we're seeing at tech companies, financial services firms, and even some of the large public accounting firms, which we absolutely should be capitalizing on. We need talent with, technological capabilities. We need talent with, that has a specialty in financial services. And we should be after these people when we hear about them. There's also data that shows that undergraduate enrollments have actually stabilized, and we're actually seeing an uptick in freshman enrollments. So that's some good news too. And, I talked to a number of universities, and many of them have said that their enrollments in their accounting programs are up too. So, I know Dan had mentioned that, this talent, talent, pipeline still continues to be tight. I feel like the tide is turning just a bit and that we're making progress there.
That's great. And, as I look at this list, there's several of these root causes that we can address within the profession that are within our control. We may not be able to offset declining birth rates or change immigration policies or the rising cost of college, but a lot of these we can work on. And I think that is a great tie-in to what you've come up with as the core principles of the Pipeline Acceleration Plan. And I know you've got those outlined for us on the next slide.
I do. And a couple, I'm not going to go through all of them, but just, a couple of things I want to point out that really frames what we're doing and why we're doing it. Obviously, we need to provide cost relief to students, right? We need to add flexibility into the system. We need to walk the talk in terms of changes at firms. And Lisa, I know you've been a huge advocate and you've talked a number of times on these town halls about what firms can do to become more attractive to entry-level talent and in retaining talent as well. Very importantly, and I think two things that I want to mention, over the last 5 years, we've been beating back state legislatures that have been trying to eliminate all types of professional licenses. It's crazy, but it includes CPAs, it includes healthcare professionals, it includes architects, it includes professions that have a real public interest. And it's really concerning because we're relied on for our expertise. And without the license, we lose our brand. And anyone would be able to step in and perform an audit. Okay, so that's not really good for the public, but there are a group of legislatures that are actually looking at this. Lisa, if you turn to the next slide, you'll see that this year's effort has been significant, and our 5-year effort has touched almost every state in the country. And we've been beating back all types of legislation that nips away at the value of our credential, and we don't take it lightly. And any change to our licensure requirements would put the future in our hands of state legislators, and I shudder at that. So that's one that framed part of why we're doing some of the things we're doing. The other thing I wanted to mention is around CPA practice mobility, and the next slide shows an almost perfect map of our CPA licensure regime that allows us to have one license that carries us from state to state to serve clients at a moment's notice. And it took us over 10 years to achieve this. And we are one of the very few professions that enjoys this type of mobility, and preserving it is really important. And again, any reduction in our education requirement or the addition of a pathway that reduces the education requirement would upset this. So that's what we were thinking as we sat down and started developing the Pipeline Acceleration Plan. How do we address those root causes without upsetting the mobility and licensure apple carts?
I think a lot of people weren't impacted by mobility, a lack of mobility back in the day, because maybe they didn't have clients in different states. Maybe now that you're able to serve clients remotely, and that is enabled by mobility around licensure, it kind of hits home a little differently when you think about it in the current context of where your client base can be. I've talked with CPAs who had to be licensed in 12 different states, and I think you've had some examples of that as well.
Yeah, virtual practice is a big deal. I myself had 3 at its highest point. I now have 2. I've talked to practitioners who had 8 and 12, and they had different CPE requirements, and they had to take different ethics courses on an annual basis. The cost associated with it, the putting yourself at risk with state enforcement, monitoring, tracking, it required elaborate systems in order just to maintain it, let alone the speed of actually getting another license and not being able to serve your client at a moment's notice, which today would not fly.
Yeah. All right. So you've shown us the beautiful map. You've shown us some of the risks around opening up different pathways, but what are some of the things that you've been working on with the team at the AICPA and the conversations that you've had with multiple stakeholders? What do you think are some of the key points that you want to talk about there? And if we could slip back to the previous slide.
Yeah, so this is the fun stuff, right? This is what are the things that are actually going to make a difference and make a difference quickly, right? And so I want to say about a month ago, maybe a little longer than that, I was on a town hall talking about our Experience Learn and Earn program, which is a very, very cost-effective program to bridge the gap for students from 120 to 150 hours of education while that student is working for the firm as a first-year staffer. I'm not going to get into a lot of detail on this because I believe in the next town hall, Julia Weislaw, who's leading this effort for us, as well as the National Association of State Boards of Accountancy, they're our partner on this. She'll be there and she'll be doing a deep dive. But this is very cost effective, $150 a credit hour for up to 30 hours of credit while the individual is working for the firm as a first-year staffer. So the max they would have to pay is about $4,500, and they're actually earning a salary, but they're an employee and there are billable hours associated with it. The second, and Lisa, I mentioned this before, you've been an amazing advocate of firms changing their business models to be more attractive. This is a big part of it too. We need to start walking the talk. We need to, establish the right culture within our firms, create opportunity and early advancement, the things that these young adults have told us that, make them step back and say, well, why would I want to do that if it's going to take me, 20 years to be a partner? And I don't understand, nor do I see the value of waiting that long. Competitive compensation is a part of it as well. And, no messaging, no branding, no marketing will help if we don't have the change that backs it up. Okay. So that's a big part of it too. And Lisa, I know you've got resources that you're coming out with to help firms kind of take a step back and look at their models and say, what do we want to be? How do we want to present ourselves?
Yeah, I'm really excited about that. So I'm going to interrupt for just a minute because
okay.
I'm so excited. We are working to bring together some of the real success stories from firms who are making changes that are impacting their culture, impacting their retention rates, and getting into some of the details of how they're actually doing it. So not just talking about, yeah, I did that. It was so easy, but talking about the real hard stuff that they had to get through, but the payoff at the end. So I'm really excited about it, and there will be a lot more to come. So I interrupted because I'd asked you to really talk about one of the things that we've seen quick action on, which is the 18-month exam window.
Yeah, that is a big issue I continuously hear about. And the 18-month window is the window within which a CPA candidate has to pass all 4 parts of the CPA exam. And that window is way too short. Life happens, work happens. And we advocated to get that 18-month window extended permanently to 30 hours. And NASBA, the National Association of State Boards of Accountancy, recently amended the Uniform Accountancy Act model rules. And now we just have to work to get each state board of accountancy across the country to adopt that in their rules. And this is way different than opening up statutes, way different than changing laws, like I mentioned earlier, with the 150 hours. This is just a rule by rule process.
And so the change doesn't happen immediately, just to tone down a little bit of the excitement that I saw on LinkedIn and Twitter. But now state boards have the okay to start considering this model language that NASBA has provided.
That's right. And we do want uniformity. And so, that 30 hours, I think, does create that needed flexibility that, CPA candidates are looking for.
Yeah, the 30-month window.
30 months, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I've been talking with some students lately, and they all agreed that 18 months was not enough. And I think there's a lot of excitement around that 30. So, anything else you want to call out on here before we move on to some of our other?
Yeah, just a couple of things. High school and college strategies are really important to the plan, and even getting to middle school, right? We've got some major activities going on here, working with firms and state societies to get into high schools and get into middle schools to create awareness and to start to kind of dispel those stereotypes. We're also discussing what an image campaign might look like at the middle and high school levels. that leverage the work that's being done by our affiliate, the Center for Audit Quality. They have a social media campaign out there called Accounting Plus that's really designed to talk to, high school students kind of where they go. So TikTok, Instagram, and stuff like that, and position the profession in a completely different light. So we're talking about what an image campaign might look like to leverage that and go beyond that. Also getting accounting recognized as a STEM field federally is really important to the plan because that frees up federal funding to create awareness of our profession and start educating about accounting as early as kindergarten. And we're having a big push this year with Congress on that. We do have bipartisan support, but as you've heard Barry, report continuously, finding a vehicle to hang something off of is not as easy as we'd like it to be. We're also advancing legislation in the House to expand the use of 529 plan funds to allow costs for the CPA exam and the CPA exam review courses. So again, we'll be looking for a vehicle, to pump that through. We've also heard from several states that they struggle finding auditors of small rural towns. I suspect many on the town hall are kind of seeing that in their local areas. And I've spoken with, state auditors about this and seeing how we might collaborate with them on solving these problems. And so we're going to be partnering with an organization called NASACT, which represents government auditors, comptrollers, and treasurers to develop recommendations and best practices to kind of ease some of that pain. So those are just a couple of other things, Lisa, we're doing. And there are many, many more, again, all in an effort to just get to those root causes and kind of, pick away at what's causing the problem.
I've recognized that this is a really complex problem. So your multi-pronged approach is great. And not one lever is going to open up the skies and have accounting students falling into our laps like it was perhaps in the 80s when I was coming out of school. So I look forward to getting feedback from others on what other ideas they have. What are we missing? What should we be exploring? But I know that a lot of hard work is going into this, and we're excited to continue the conversation with you over the coming town halls. So with that, I think we're ready for open forum, and we'll have the studio joining us.
We are ready. So Lisa, Sue, great discussion. Really appreciate you pointing all that out for our audience. And we are going to move into open forum. And since the topic is fresh, Sue and Lisa, maybe I'll stay with you. Sue, one question is, you kind of mentioned ELE as a cost-effective way for students. Will it work in small firms?
Absolutely. In fact, one of the core principles of defining the program was that it was scalable for small firms. And it's just a matter of, the firm finding the employee and running them through the program that will be delivered by the university system. And so what we're doing is we're targeting universities that are willing to work at our price point. We're helping them identify and deliver a menu of courses. And so the firm and the student/employee would kind of tailor their own program based on what the firm needs in that employee. So it could be tax, it could be audit, it could be soft skills, it could be communications, it could be strategic planning, it could be business development.
That's great, Sue. I mean, there's so many variables in this. So great job laying out this initiative. So maybe let's pivot back to some of the conversation that we had earlier. Dan, I'll kind of start with you. One of the questions that came in was, we talked a lot about growth, but maybe comment on the impact you see private equity or that the alternative business model structure maybe having on growth. Does it infuse a ton of pressure into the system, or?
In some ways, yes, very much, particularly for the individual firms, right? That's a lot of pressure on them to hit numbers that previously, if they didn't hit their numbers, they were only responsible to themselves. Now they've got an outside partner. In terms of the top 100, what we're really seeing is individual, the 2 or 3 firms there, the Eisner Ampers, the Citron Coopermans that have taken PE. They're obviously ramping up their acquisition strategies significantly, and where we're seeing that impact, not maybe the overall growth so much, though it's certainly playing a role in that. But we're seeing it really impact the roster. because they're now looking at some of the smaller firms on the top 100 firms list. So we've already seen spaces open up from their acquisition. So the overall growth rate, maybe the top 100, it'll impact it a little bit, but really it's the changing the roster of the firms there.
Anything you wanted to add?
No, I think that's a very accurate answer. And we always have had a profession that, new firms move into the top 100. That has been going on for decades and will continue to do so. And it's an opportunity for firms as well, even when that consolidation's occurring at that $1 billion mark, like you talked about before.
Great. And Barry, kind of pivoting off of that a little bit, but just what's happening, across the market, particularly in the banking and financial services. We had a question to come in, maybe, talking about what's happening, but even more specifically, do we see or do you see maybe a few more banks failing before this thing kind of flushes itself out?
Yeah, there's certainly a lot of rumors out there, right? I think it seems to be a slow matriculation of problems, and I think you sort of ask why. What is the catalyst that? I think there's a pretty strong consensus in Washington and on Wall Street, for instance, that I think that the issue of corporate deposits is a big part of how these mid-sized banks really function. Individuals aren't moving their deposits, but corporates are all of a sudden a little bit more aware of the issue of their float and all of those types of things. And, mid-sized companies can have pretty large floats at payroll time and bill pay time and all of those things. And I think it's can banks really attract or keep those corporate deposits, which then allows them, of course, to have the cash to make loans and things of that nature. That's very important. I think that's where the squeeze gets. It's that middle part, and we talk about that a lot. It's true in firms. Small firms can be niche. Sue just answered that somewhat in the ELE question, can be niched and can be at that level. And you got the big firms that have different sets of resources to play. And you can do that in medicine. You can do it in entertainment. You can do it in manufacturing. That middle part, sort of an hourglass notion, is always the most difficult to predict. And I think that's where the banking issue is right now.
Yeah, we'll see. So let's close on a small firm question. We had a couple of questions come in, particularly when we were talking about growth, but really just the prospects for the smaller firm. I mean, Sue touched on it, like you said, a little bit with the LE, but even the future of audit and the small firm. Barry, I'd love to hear and Sue too, your comments, thoughts on it.
Well, sir, first off, just so everybody knows, and I was a small firm person. I was hired in a 2-person firm out of college, and I made partner in that firm, and it was a 4-partner firm. I never got bigger than a 4-partner firm, and obviously I've been working for the profession, other than that. So I'm very, very positive about small firms. I do think it comes back to what I just said. It's about the ability in small firms to niche, to be focused. I think, we've seen the evolution from 20 years ago today of a small firm no longer really being able to be the answer for everybody. And I think that continues. But that doesn't mean you can't do audits. In fact, we have small firms that are phenomenal in doing audits. I do think it's about making sure you have the competency and thinking about really what types of industries you do audits in. It may not be you can do an audit in any industry, but you really can focus in a certain area, or ERISA plans, or any type of specific audit. I think small firms can be very successful and efficient in that.
Thanks, Barry. Well, I want to thank all of our speakers. Just another great town hall today. Lots of great information. Can't thank you enough. Dan, our special guest, appreciate it. You brought some really insightful information to us today. Just kind of to recap today's town hall again, debt limit comes into full view next week. Bill could include some important tax provisions that Barry shared with us in depth. However, any bill is going to require bipartisan support, so your guess is as good as mine. A great report out on large firms, very strong growth rates. Firms are deploying a multitude of strategies, we heard, to drive this growth. There's clearly a push into advisory services, as Dan spoke about. But again, many of these patterns extend more broadly to firms of all sizes. And, I see it firsthand. We work with a whole host of smaller firms who are just crushing it, just very progressive, very nimble. And it's about having the right strategy and go to market plan. The new ERC audit notice and PPP interplay that we heard from with Lisa. And then lastly, a great update on the talent pipeline. There's a whole variety of factors that are driving this. Clearly the AICPA has identified and begun implementing some key actions targeting the root causes of the pipeline challenges. And so we're encouraged by the future, and we'll continue to have ongoing discussions with key stakeholders around this. Few housekeeping items. Again, all of the town halls are available on demand on our website. Here you see a list of the most recent. I want to go back, and it includes all of the slides and information for you to be able to reference. Another big call out is AICPA's flagship conference event, Engage, happening June 5th to 8th at the Aria in Las Vegas. It's a fantastic event. We're going to have a wonderful turnout. And as importantly, it is going to be the 100th edition of the AICPA Town Hall Series. We've got a great lineup for you next week, May 18th. But then we will be on site at Engage. It will be on Tuesday, June 6th. So we'll go off schedule by a couple of days. We have Barry there. We have former AICPA Chair Kimberly Ellison Taylor. Of course, Lisa Simpson. Someone asked, is Eric going to be there? They didn't see his picture. He'll absolutely be there. Moderator, I don't think you could keep him from being there. And we're going to have Alex Dorr joining us as well. So until May 18th, wishing you all the best. And thank you again for being with us today. And we hope as many of you as possible can join us in person on June 6th in Las Vegas. Have a great rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you for your participation. You can now subscribe to the AICPA Town Hall Series on your favorite podcast platform, as well as watch archives on YouTube and AICPA TV. Tune in for live broadcasts Thursdays at 3 p.m. Eastern Time.